Can everybody hear me?
All right.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight, and thank you all for coming. I've been writing and speaking about the economic impact of shale gas drilling for over 3 years now. I've been critiquing many of the industry-funded studies and comparing the conclusions of the industry-funded studies to the conclusions of unbiased, independent economic research. Conclusions from unbiased research are vastly different from the conclusions made by the industry-funded studies. Last year, I was looking forward to reading the economic assessment done by Ecology and Environment. That's the firm that was hired by the New York State DEC to do the economic analysis for the revised draft SGEIS. I was hoping it would be the study that was really needed, a comprehensive, unbiased, and transparent economic assessment. Boy, was I wrong. When I was reading it, I had to look at the cover again to be sure that I hadn't accidentally picked up one of those industry-funded studies that I had been critiquing. The gas industry claims that hydrofracking is safe and that shale gas is a clean fuel. There's much evidence that it's not safe and it's not a clean fuel. The gas industry claims that the vast reserves of shale gas in the United States will reduce our dependence on foreign fuel. The fact is that many of the shale gas rights in our country have been sold to foreign corporations, and the industry is getting permits to convert large liquid natural gas importing terminals into exporting terminals. The price of natural gas in Europe and China is much higher than in the US because elsewhere the price of natural gas is indexed to the price of oil. So the gas companies have recognized that they can make a much larger profit by converting the gas to liquid natural gas and shipping it overseas. How does that reduce our energy dependence? And subjecting our gas to global markets, the price will increase, as has been concluded in a recent study by the Energy Information Administration. Even without exports, there are reasons to believe that natural gas will not be a cheap energy source. For example, the Pickens plan would convert large truck fleets to natural gas. Mayor Bloomberg has been pushing for the large buildings right here in New York City to convert to natural gas for heating. And the recent EPA ruling will encourage the building of natural gas power plants. All of these things will put further upward pressure on the price of natural gas. I joined a couple of elected officials from upstate New York to meet with Tom Congdon, Governor Cuomo's Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment. After expressing our many and varied concerns about hydrofracking, he said that he feels that the low natural gas prices will help residents save money on heating their homes, and also the low prices will encourage manufacturing industries to return to New York State. I fear that the administration in Albany may be short-sighted regarding shale gas development, its risks, and even its expected price levels. It seems that almost every week a new piece of research comes out that reports additional bad news, either having to do with drinking water contamination, poisonous air emissions, radon in Marcellus gas, earthquakes, or negative economic impacts. And by the way, a recent MIT study, as well as a 2010 study by the Aspen Environmental Group, indicated that increased natural gas development will postpone serious investments in renewable energy. Supporters of shale gas development like to call shale gas a bridge fuel, but others, such as the Aspen Environmental Group, point out that it may actually be a bridge to nowhere. We often hear it stated by industry and in the press, and yes, even on NPR, that it's worth taking the risk with the negative environmental and health impacts because it will be great for the economy. The economy, and especially jobs, are a major concern right now. So people really want to believe the industry claims about job creation. Please remember that the oil and gas industry has a lot of money to spend on lobbying, political contributions, advertising, PR, and even economic impact studies in order to influence the public and our elected officials and policymakers. Independent and academic research and experience with gas drilling shows that regions with gas drilling are economically worse off in the long run. It is well known that extractive industries, including shale gas, create short-term booms followed by long-term busts. Extractive industries are not long-term sustainable industries. Certainly some jobs will be created, but they are not long-term jobs. Many of the workers that take the short-term jobs are transient workers from out of state, and they send most of their income to their families back in their home states to be spent there, improving the economies there, not here in New York. Our decision makers in Albany may be on the verge of making bad choices for the health of our regional economy. Alan Krueger, when he was Chief Economist and Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury, stated, "The oil and gas industry is about 10 times more capital intensive than the U.S. economy as a whole." Krueger continued, saying that encouraging oil and gas production is not an effective strategy for creating jobs. The reality is that even renewables are relatively capital intensive as industries go, but it's interesting to note that some research out of the University of Massachusetts shows that the number of jobs created for every $1 million of expenditures on producing oil and natural gas is only 3.7 jobs, while between 9.5 and 12.4 jobs are created for every $1 million spent on producing renewables. Let me give you just a few examples of studies not funded by the gas industry. One example of a peer-reviewed study found that the highest levels of long-term poverty are in places where there was once a thriving extractive industry. Another peer-reviewed study discusses the resource curse as it affects the United States. Economists have long known about the resource curse as it affects developing nations. Basically, it means that natural resource dependence tends to be associated with lower economic growth. This fact has recently been tested in the United States at the disaggregated county level by some economists from the University of Wyoming. Their research was published last year in the journal Resource and Energy Economics. They conclude that there is clear evidence that resource-dependent counties in the United States exhibit more anemic growth even after controlling for state-specific effects, socioeconomic differences, and initial income. Headwaters Economics, a nonprofit firm out west, not funded by the gas industry, concluded that counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction as an economic development strategy experienced higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low income households, and more retirement and investment income. Oh, and by the way, while I'm discussing a study done out west, Jill Morrison of the Powder River Basin Resource Council in Wyoming reported that there have been 10% to 15% increases in crime rates in the counties in Wyoming where there have been gas booms. She also said that they had terrible drug problems, particularly with methamphetamines, coming into the counties with the gas booms. These counties have had to increase the size of their jails. These would be significant costs to our upstate areas. I personally looked at data for New York State, and I'm clearly not funded by the gas industry, nor am I funded by any environmental organization, to be clear. Anyway, New York State has had conventional vertical gas drilling for a long time. So I looked at the top 10 gas-producing counties in New York for the period from 2006 to 2008. The gas-intensive counties were not better off than neighboring counties without gas drilling when you look at the number of families below poverty level, median household income, or unemployment rates. All of the industry-funded studies, and even the revised draft SGEIS, share similar omissions, exaggerations, and flaws. They ignore significant economic costs, and they exaggerate the economic benefits, including employment, income, and tax revenue. They all ignore the likelihood that some important industries vital to upstate New York will likely decline due to the industrialization of the landscape and the risk of water and air contamination. Such industries include tourism, agriculture, organic farming, winemaking, beer making, hunting, fishing, river, and lake recreation, just to name a few. For example, major food co-ops have stated they will not buy produce from areas that have hydraulic fracturing, and there will be a high cost if our agricultural lands and nearby water become contaminated with toxic or radioactive substances. The fresh produce and meat from upstate New York that we in the entire metropolitan region like to eat and buy from our farmers markets could become contaminated. The potential negative impacts to agriculture of water and land contamination risk is being ignored in Albany. Potential negative impacts on the tourism industry have been dismissed. The Catskill Mountains and the Finger Lakes are two of New York State's most important tourist regions, and they are on the Shale. These regions and others should be carefully evaluated for potential negative impacts. Increasing second home ownership and retirement homes are very important to these areas as well, and the impact on that trend should be studied. Costs to communities have been ignored. Costs associated with the increased demand for community services, police and fire departments, first responders, and local hospitals should be estimated. Truck traffic and increased numbers of serious accidents and wear and tear on the roads is ignored in all of the studies. There are around 1,000 large truck trips for each frac job, and this much traffic does a lot of damage, and it also creates further pollution. A confidential New York State Department of Transportation memo was leaked, and it estimated that between $120 million and $220 million of local road costs would result, and another $90 to $150 million of state road costs. This actually sounds like a low estimate when you consider that in Arkansas, it looks like the state taxpayers are getting stuck paying about $400 million worth of damage to state highways after the gas industry damaged the roads there. And this doesn't include the damage to county and local roads. And very recently, it was reported by the Texas Department of Transportation, which foots most of the bill for road damage, and of course that means that the taxpayers of Texas are paying. They estimated in only 3 of the 10 counties of the Eagle Ford Shale formation, projected road maintenance needs during the next 5 years is about $500 million, triple the amount projected before the boom. It appears that our own New York State DOT may have underestimated the cost of road damage if you compare it to Arkansas and Texas actuals, but in any case, 0 cost for roads was included in our own SGEIS. And by the way, when thinking about the cost of roads and other costs to both our state and local taxpayers, think about a recent study done by a Penn State professor who concluded that in Pennsylvania, most local governments being affected by shale gas development are not seeing more tax revenue as a result, while 26% of the local governments indicated that related costs had increased. Will our local governments, or our state for that matter, have sufficient funds to cover the significant costs that have not even been estimated? Still more costs are ignored in the industry-funded studies and also in our SGEIS. All health costs have been ignored. In fact, there has been no health impact assessment at all done for New York State. Property values have been a contentious issue in this debate. In Texas, the Wise County Central Real Estate Appraisal Board has devalued homes by as much as 75% if a gas well sits on the property. Remember that a decline in property values means that there'll be a decline in property tax revenues. And several experts have pointed out problems in the mortgage market, and in particular the fact that the gas leases are in violation of residential mortgage terms. Also, about 90% of the mortgages are sold on the secondary market. Residential mortgages have requirements concerning setbacks and hazardous materials and restrictions on commercial activity. The risk goes beyond the small homeowner and the local lending institution. It could impact the entire real estate industry and the US economy in a bad way. I recommend the article by Elizabeth Radow on this subject in the New York State Bar Association Journal. We already know that some banks are not willing to issue mortgages to homeowners with gas wells or nearby gas wells, and that insurance companies will not issue homeowners policies. So how can you sell your home if the buyer can't get a mortgage or a homeowner's insurance policy, or if the drinking water is contaminated? Property values on the shale may plummet. This cost is ignored in the industry studies, and it's not adequately addressed in the SGEIS. Another important economic impact on the region that is completely ignored is the loss of future economic development potential after a spider web of pipelines, including gathering lines, transmission lines, and larger pipelines, is built, preventing future building on or near these pipelines. This may be a significant opportunity cost going forward. In addition to many significant costs being ignored, benefits are exaggerated in both the industry-funded studies and in the SGEIS. All of the studies seem to be based on exaggerated production assumptions. The SGEIS assumes that each newly constructed well will have an average productive life of 30 years. Other researchers have shown that the productive life of a shale gas well is far shorter than 30 years, more like 4 to 7.5 years. The most recent estimate of technically recoverable gas in the Marcellus Shale is only 84 trillion cubic feet, far lower than the 410 trillion cubic feet used in the DEC's report. And Deborah just did an excellent job of pointing out that reserves may be vastly overstated. So remember, if exaggerated production assumptions go into an economic model, then exaggerated projections of employment, income, and tax revenue come out. Another exaggerated assumption appears to be the number of jobs created per well. Remember, when you see jobs created per well, workers move from well to well. These are usually not full-time workers on each well. Also note that there are multiple phases of well construction and production. The DEC's SGEIS assumes 11.3 full-time equivalent workers per well during construction phase and 0.17 full-time equivalent workers to operate a well. I have seen other estimates. For example, there's at least one researcher who has estimated only one full-time equivalent job created per well during the drilling and development phase. Also, there are technical problems with the methodology used. Economists often use input-output analysis when they want to show employment, income, and tax revenue impacts from a new development. It can be a very useful technique, and I've used it. However, it must be used carefully, and in some cases, it is simply not appropriate as a standalone technique, and this is one of those cases. I've explained in detail in some of my past writings and testimony some of the many problems with using input-output analysis for this situation. I've been told, however, that when I go through these reasons in a public talk, it is EGO material, eyes glaze over. I think that phrase was coined by James Brady, President Reagan's press secretary. So if you're interested in my comments, the technical comments on why input-output analysis is not good to be used here, I'll let you read them. Suffice it to say here that input-output analysis overstates the positive and leaves out many negative impacts. On my last slide, I'm going to give you a web page where you can find a lot of the things I've written on this subject. So while the gas companies in their corporate boardrooms are clearly considering all the costs and benefits to them in deciding when, where, and how much drilling to do, they are not taking account of the many costs to New Yorkers in the form of environmental and health costs, costs to communities, infrastructure costs, and the negative impacts on other industries. We must insist that our leaders in Albany take the same pains as are taken in the corporate boardrooms to consider, with eyes wide open, all of the costs to New Yorkers. Let's take a look at some of the employment estimates made by industry-funded researchers and compare them to publicly available and unbiased data. An early estimate of job creation by industry was that 88,000 Marcellus-related jobs were created in Pennsylvania in 2010. Public data available at that time showed that only 65,000 jobs were created statewide in all industries in Pennsylvania in 2010, and half of those were in education and health and in leisure and hospitality. Later, industry claimed that 48,000 jobs were created in 1 year. At least they came down from their 88,000 number. But the Keystone Research Center, not industry funded, found that in 3 years, less than 6,000 net new jobs were created in Marcellus core and ancillary industries. Yes, less than 6,000 net new jobs in 3 years. And more recently, as Ohio has begun to be exploited for shale gas, an industry-funded study claimed that 200,000 jobs will be created over the next few years. An independent study, not industry-funded, estimated that there will be only 20,000 jobs created, 1/10 of the industry's estimate. Perhaps of greatest concern is the statement that President Obama made in his State of the Union address, that 600,000 jobs will be created by shale gas development. This number is also from an industry-funded study that is flawed. I also wrote a critique of this study. The honest-to-goodness truth is that we don't yet know how many good long-term jobs will be created in the Marcellus Shale region, but we do know that the industry is exaggerating many things. Surely there will be short-term jobs created during the short-term boom, but we don't know how many of these jobs will be going to state residents, how many are long-term, and how many are good jobs. The industry and its coalitions like to tell anecdotes about job creation, how somebody's son got to return to rural Pennsylvania because he could get a job with the gas industry. Well, that's very nice, but there are anecdotes on both sides of the issue. There was a recent report of a gas company in Pennsylvania having hired 60 workers from out of state. The workers relocated a long distance, were staying in a hotel, and they were promised good long-term jobs, and then they were fired within a month. The company had decided suddenly to curtail production. I don't think we should be paying attention to anecdotal clips that support either side. We should look at real data, analysis, and research done by highly qualified and unbiased experts. Thanks. I'm glad you all agree. We can learn a few things about the economic impacts of shale gas development by looking at some data and research from 2 states where shale gas drilling is taking place. First, Pennsylvania. There have been some interesting findings in several studies there. Experience in Pennsylvania tells us that environmental and economic justice may be issues. Increased homelessness has become a problem as rents have been bid up by new workers moving in, and some landlords have increased rents dramatically. Dr. Bonita Kolb of Lycoming College did a study funded by the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. She concluded that while the effects are broad-based and include some positive impacts on housing, the negative impacts are most severely felt by those who live on the economic fringe, the working poor, seniors, the disabled, and the non-working poor. By 2012, almost 5,000 wells had been drilled in Pennsylvania. A study out of the Penn State Cooperative Extension shows that only 1 of the 50 wealthiest school districts in Pennsylvania had a single Marcellus well by the middle of 2010. And it found that school districts with drilling on average experienced declines in total local revenues. The same study found that districts with more drilling activity on average lost a somewhat larger percentage of students than did districts with less activity or no drilling. The study speculates that the negative association between enrollment size and drilling activity may be due to the exodus out of the districts of lower income and renting households who are leaving because they can't afford the higher rents and costs of living those communities are experiencing due to the influx of transient workers arriving without families. This is all further evidence that many of the workers are indeed temporary and from out of state. They are not paying local taxes or spending much locally. Another study by the Penn State Cooperative Extension was done on the impacts of dairy farms. It found that higher drilling is associated with large average decreases in the number of dairy cows and that declines in milk production are higher in counties with drilling. While it is too early to draw definitive conclusions from Pennsylvania, early evidence shows that dairy farming may be suffering due to shale gas development. Let's look at Texas for a minute. The Barnett Shale has been fracked since around 2001, longer than Pennsylvania. So I decided to take a look at some data to see how the folks in the core Barnett Shale counties are doing. There are 4 counties in Texas that are considered the core drilling area. They're Denton, Johnson, Tarrant, and Wise counties. Back in early 2010, I wrote a paper called Unanswered Questions about the economic impact of gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale. Don't jump to conclusions. In that paper, I explained that comparing the economic impact of shale gas drilling in 2 states, Texas and New York State, is like comparing apples to oranges. Texas has had a well-established oil and gas industry for many years, and they have a labor force with the requisite skill sets. Oil and gas headquarters and main offices are in Texas, and they have all of the established ancillary industries ensconced there as well. New York does not have a lot of workers with the required skill sets, nor the oil and gas headquarters, nor extensive ancillary industries. So Texas is likely to do better than New York State economically from shale gas development. So it was kind of amusing when once I had a bunch of Texans in an audience when I was explaining this, and they jumped up and said Texas gas counties aren't really doing that well either. So when I wanted to look at the data. So when I looked at unemployment rates, growth of median household income, and the number of people in poverty, it doesn't appear that the Barnett Shale core counties are doing better than the rest of the state. I'm the first to admit that there are many reasons for differences between county and state data and trends. But it's interesting to note that for the period from 2003 to 2010, median household income increased by over 21% in the state of Texas. But in the 4 core counties, median household income only increased between 10 and 16%. And for the same period, the increase in the average unemployment rates for the 4 counties, it increased by 2 percentage points. This was very similar and even a little higher than the increase in the state unemployment rate that increased by 1.5 percentage points in the same period. Finally, the number of people in poverty in the 4 core shale counties increased in percentage terms just as much as statewide. So the Texans who were in that other audience appear to be right. When you consider the number of people in poverty, the unemployment rate, and median household income growth, gas-intensive counties in Texas don't appear to be doing so great compared to the state as a whole. Let me just talk a minute about tax revenue. Supporters of gas drilling in New York often point to the ad valorem tax as a revenue stream for local communities. A study by the Public Policy Institute indicates that the ad valorem tax will result in generous tax revenues to localities. There are many uncertainties regarding the ad valorem tax as it applies to shale gas development. When one considers the potential costs that may be incurred by local communities, it is far from clear that the ad valorem tax will be sufficient to pay the increased community costs, increased public health costs, and mitigation of the environmental impacts. It is clear that the ad valorem tax will not cover costs to communities early in the drilling process, as the tax starts to be collected several years after production has started. There will be substantial costs to communities prior to the collection of the ad valorem tax, and small upstate communities do not have excess cash to cover these costs. It's uncertain whether the discount rates used to calculate the tax are appropriate in light of the high risk associated with horizontal high-volume slick water hydraulic fracturing. We know that in 2009, local governments in New York State received on average approximately $600 in tax revenue from each producing oil and gas well. This was the ad valorem tax. The cost to communities that will result from fracking are likely to far exceed this. Oh, and by the way, the production figures used to calculate the ad valorem tax are reported by the gas companies. They're on an honor system to report accurately production for purposes of calculating the tax. I see you find this as ludicrous as I do. So a mechanism must be put in place to have independent, unbiased reporting of production. Most states have a severance tax on gas production, and some states have both an ad valorem tax and a severance tax. New York State must take the time and spend the money required to have a thorough analysis done of all tax and fee possibilities to be sure that we are not simply giving away a valuable resource and creating many financial and other problems for New Yorkers. Make sure that you question industry claims. Let's look at a few different but somewhat related examples of industry claims. The ethylene cracker plant. Most of you have probably heard about the ethylene cracker plant that Shell Oil is going to build in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. A cracker plant separates wet gas and produces ethylene that is in turn used in plastics and other chemical industries. There was competition among West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, each state hoping that Shell would decide to locate there. There are concerns about quality of air emissions near the cracker plant, but beyond the air emissions issue, it's interesting to consider the economics. Each state offered tax incentives to entice Shell. In fact, I saw a report that Pennsylvania created a Keystone Opportunity Zone, whereby the plant will pay virtually no taxes to the state for 15 years. So I've seen reports that this plant would create 10,000 construction jobs. You all know that construction jobs are just during the construction phase. They go away. And then the plant would create another 10,000 permanent jobs. Note that the facility will be built on 300 acres. So I looked into another ethylene cracker plant owned by Shell, but located in Norco, Louisiana. The Shell website states that this plant is on 1,000 acres and has only about 600 full-time employees. In other words, the Norco cracker plant is on more than 3 times as much acreage, but has only 6% the number of jobs. Does this make sense? I don't know. But it's an example of a claim that should be questioned. Let's take a quick look at job claims made by the industry about the Keystone XL pipeline. The Perryman Group, a consulting firm hired by TransCanada, concluded that 119,000 jobs would be created by the Keystone pipeline. Cornell University's Global Labor Institute found the Perryman Group's study on the Keystone XL pipeline to be flawed, and the employment numbers highly exaggerated. The Cornell report concluded that employment potential from the Keystone XL pipeline is little to none. We really should not be listening to the oil and gas industry. They have been proven wrong too many times. Sadly, the media, not to mention our president, often repeats industry's claims. It sounds like industry's plan now is to export much of the shale gas. Then we in New York and other shale states may be left with contaminated water and land, public health issues, and bust economies, while the gas companies are selling the gas abroad. It's good that Representative Markey of Massachusetts has introduced 2 bills to prevent significant natural gas exports. He seems to be one of the relatively few leaders in DC who understands the situation and is also trying to take action on it. A thorough economic assessment should include estimates for all significant costs, and it should be careful to accurately estimate benefits. I feel that a proper assessment should include detailed recommendations regarding action steps to help maximize the benefits and minimize the costs. I have not seen such recommendations in any of the studies, not even in the DEC study. The pace and scale of drilling can significantly affect long-term impacts, and the various alternatives regarding pace and scale should be carefully analyzed. Tax policy recommendations and financial assurance recommendations should be made to be sure that funding is available to communities for their increased costs and also for environmental mitigation. Even if legal liability for these costs is placed on the gas companies, this is no assurance of recovery. Anyone who tried to recover an indemnity from Enron can tell you how valuable those are. If the commentators are correct and some of the prominent independent gas companies go bust, recovery will only be available if far-sighted legislators have required them to post substantial bonds and insurance indemnities. I don't want to see statewide taxpayers get stuck paying for environmental mitigation and possibly widespread public health and social service impacts, while the gas industry collects the profits and pays its shareholders or goes bust. There should be an in-depth study done and recommendations made of how best to tax gas production, be it an ad valorem tax as currently exists or a severance tax, which New York State does not have now, or both, as many states have. We must be sure that funds are available as needed. And a long-term economic development plan for the entire region must be in place to help minimize the negative effects of a potential economic bust. Here are the 4 major things to take away from all of my comments. Number 1, as of now, nobody has conducted an adequate economic impact study of gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale. Number 2, the oil and gas industry has a lot of money to spend on political contributions, lobbying, advertising, PR, and economic impact studies. They want to influence the public and our elected officials so that they will maximize their profits, but it will be at the expense of all of us, our health, our communities, and our economy. Number 3, the only parties likely to benefit financially in the long run from gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale are the gas companies and their shareholders and a few lucky and large landowners. The rest of us will be stuck with many of the costs. And finally, please get informed about fracking and tell everyone you know about it. And take some action steps to let your elected leaders know how you feel. Let them know that we need a health impact assessment and an unbiased, comprehensive economic impact assessment. Feel free to contact me. Here's my email. And here at the bottom of this slide is the web page where you can find many of my writings on this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jannette.